from a criminal standpoint. I commend her for the great work she's done, and I certainly look forward to hearing her comments now.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciated, Mr. President, I'm sorry, may I be recognized?
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you. Mr. President, I first of all want to thank my colleague from Georgia, who is the ranking member Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So Senator Chambliss has seen so much in terms of the real threats that we face from terrorists in this country, and I appreciate his leadership on ensuring that America remains safe, his leadership on this issue of ensuring that the Guantanamo detainees are not released to get back in the fight against us, to attack not only our soldiers but us and our allies. And I guess I would start with this, is the defense authorization right now as it stands, and even the side-by-side offered by Chairman Levin, it's a dramatic change from current policy of where we are now with regard to Guantanamo and the transfer of Guantanamo detainees internationally into the United States of America between last year's defense authorization and this year's defense authorization. So what has changed? The only thing that has changed is the fact that the re-engagement rate of those who are suspected of having been released, who have been released from Guantanamo and are suspected or who actually have re-engaged in the fight against us has increased, not decreased. And yet the status quo of where we are right now, if our amendment that was just described by Senator Chambliss is not adopted, Amendment 2255, is that we would weaken what is required to be certified from people who are released from Guantanamo. So in other words, the defense authorization and the proposal offered by Chairman Levin would weaken the national security waivers that are currently in place, the standards in which you have to meet before someone is transferred from Guantanamo to another country, even though the re-engagement rate has actually increased. What else would it do? It would now allow the potential for transferring Guantanamo detainees to the United States of America. And that would include Guantanamo detainees potentially like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that Senator Chambliss referenced. He is the mastermind of September 11th, the key player behind the attacks on our country on September 11th. And so we're going to allow the potential that he could be transferred to the United States of America. In addition to that, there is allowance for potential transfer to the country of Yemen. And as Senator Chambliss has talked about, the country of Yemen is a place where where al-Qaeda is centered in the Arabian Peninsula. But not only that, in Yemen there have actually been instances where we have seen prison breaks in Yemen. In fact, it's a very destabilized place. In June, I asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about Yemen, and he assessed it to be the most dangerous. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is located in Yemen, is the most dangerous al-Qaeda affiliate. Yemen, again, when we look at Yemen, there have been breaks from detention facilities there. As Senator Chambliss described, the 2009 Christmas Day bomber received his training in Yemen. And we have Guantanamo detainees who have actually been captured, who we've let out previously, captured, killed, or spotted in Yemen. These included al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's former second-in-command, Saeed al-Shihiri, and Ibrahim Suleiman al-Rubash, alleged to be one of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's main religious leaders. So we have instances where in Yemen there actually have been al-Qaeda terrorists, some who have joined the leadership, back with the leadership of al-Qaeda after we've released them from Guantanamo and they've gotten back in. And so I would ask, why are we lifting the prohibition on transfer to Yemen when there still is not a certification that can be made that they won't re-engage and that Yemen even can detain these individuals or account for them in a place where it is the head of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Let me just say that where we are right now is very important in terms of the protection of our country. As Senator Chambliss mentioned, the administration has been so caught up in not wanting to transfer anyone into Guantanamo that we are left with a situation where we are potentially losing valuable intelligence to protect our country. And let me talk about that. If we captured tomorrow the current head of al-Qaeda, Anwar al-Awlaki, excuse me, I want to correct that again, Zawahiri, what would we do with him? Are we going to bring him to the United States? Or should we bring him to a secure detention facility at Guantanamo? Because the legal questions that are raised by this, in terms of if we bring him to the United States, are we going to tell him you have the right to remain silent, even though he is the current head of al-Qaeda? Shouldn't the first priority be to collect information to protect our country, to know what they're planning, to know what they're up to know what can happen next? But right now where we are is that we have the example that was given of Warsame, who was a terrorist that was captured overseas, and instead of being brought to Guantanamo, he was put on a ship for approximately 60 days and then brought to the United States, where he was told you have the right to remain silent. Even worse, recently there was the capture of a man named al-Libi, and al-Libi actually had been involved in the beginning. In fact, the director of the FBI recently said before the Homeland Security Committee he was a founder of al-Qaeda with Osama bin Laden. We captured him in Libya, and rather than bring him to Guantanamo Bay, he was put on a ship for only a week. A week. Then he was transferred to New York City and read his Miranda rights. This is someone who is alleged to have committed the bombings against the embassies in Africa in 1998, but someone who has decades involvement in al-Qaeda and who was only interrogated on a ship for a week rather than being brought to Guantanamo and fully interrogated to make sure that we maximize the gathering of intelligence to protect our country. And so now the administration wants to close Guantanamo, and the alternative offered by Chairman Levin is that they should come up with a plan of where we would put these detainees in the United States of America. Well, I guess the question is, how come we've had to wait this long, first of all, to even have some information of what the plan would be with what to do? But second of all, why would we want the most dangerous terrorists in the world, some of them, to come to the United States of America when we have a secure detention facility at Guantanamo? Why would we risk the legal questions that will be raised if we bring them to the United States of, do we have to read the Miranda? If we capture Zawahiri and we have no Guantanamo Bay to bring him to, do we have to read him Miranda because he's in the United States of America, so we can't gather intelligence to protect our country? How much does it cost to make sure that the people are secure in the area where these terrorists are being brought? And by the way, we don't even know where they'll be brought, because the alternative amendment, all it says is that they have to come up with a plan of where to put these terrorists rather than at Guantanamo. And we don't know. We have no way. The amendment does not provide for us as a Congress to approve this plan. It just says that the Secretary of Defense has to come up with the plan, and then he may take actions to transfer the detainees and allowing them to be transferred to the United States of America. So stay tuned if the Guantanamo detainees are coming to your neighborhood, because we don't know. And that is why it's important that the prohibitions stay in place in the absence of any plan. But why should we bring them to the United States of America, given the dangerous nature of who they are? And also, why wouldn't we want to have a secure facility to ensure that we have a place to interrogate terrorists, to make sure that we can maximize the information and understand what they know to prevent attacks against our country. Otherwise, we'll continue to have a situation where terrorists like al-Libi are only interrogated for a week and then they are told you have the right to remain silent, and no terrorist should hear that right. Let me just say that what this provision does is it puts back in place the requirements that the administration has to meet a strong national security waiver before they can transfer to third-party countries. And so what was taken out? Let me just tell you what was taken out, which is important. The way they have weakened the waiver of transferring people of the requirement that the administration must meet before transferring from Guantanamo to third-party countries is they've taken out language that requires the Secretary of Defense currently to certify that a country is not a state sponsor of terrorism or a foreign terrorist organization. So now there's no longer a requirement that we even have to certify that. So we will now, if our amendment is not passed and the alternative is passed, if there is a country or an entity that's a state sponsor of terrorism or a foreign terrorist organization, then they can transfer there. They've also taken out the provision that would consider whether we have previously transferred a detainee to the country and yet the detainee has gotten back into the fight, has re-engaged. So in other words, if we made a mistake in the past and transferred someone out of Guantanamo to a country like Yemen and they weren't able to secure the individual and that individual gets back in the fight, that was a consideration they had to take into account before they could transfer to that country. That is now being removed from the national security waiver, making it much weaker and easier to transfer to countries that are not only potential sponsors of terrorism, but are also countries where we've already had a history of transferring detainees who have gotten back again in the fight against us and our soldiers. And by the way, we've seen some of these detainees show up in places like Afghanistan against our soldiers. We have seen these detainees attempt to attack us and our allies, and we cannot risk weakening the provisions to say we're going to transfer them and take our risks that they can do that again. We should keep the current law in place. And the administration has been able to meet the current law. They have transferred 6 detainees this year, so they do not have an excuse to say that we can't transfer anyone because they've already been able to transfer people. Mr. President, I would like to be able to ask my colleague from Georgia a question about these provisions.
Without objection.
Senator Chambliss, if we eliminate Guantanamo, in other words, under this proposal they would be permitted to transfer people to the United States of America, or new captures be brought to the United States of America instead of to a facility like Guantanamo, what are the risks we face in terms of losing valuable intelligence that we need to protect our country?
Well, you know, the very best tool that we have been able to utilize from an intelligence gathering standpoint is the information that we gather from individuals who were involved in the crime or involved in the planning of the crime. And that's the case whether it's an ordinary burglary or a bank robbery, or in the case that we're talking about today, the planning and the scheming of the carrying out of what happened on September 11 as terrorist activity, as well as terrorist activity prior to that, such as the USS Cole bombing and others, as well as terrorist activity against the United States subsequent to September 11, as well as the detainees who are at Guantanamo today who were captured on the battlefield in Afghanistan. We have gone through each one of the detainees who were involved in specific incidents or who are battlefield captured detainees, and we've been able to gather intelligence from them that simply we would not have been able to get from anyone else. Now, a lot of times what you have is when you interrogate detainees, you'll know the answer to the question that you're going to ask them. And sometimes it's information that was gleaned from detainee X who was with detainee Y that you're now interrogating. And by virtue of the fact that you know information that you've already gleaned from detainee X. You can ask terrorist Y about it or detainee Y, and you're going to get not only verification of what the first interrogated detainee tells you, but all of a sudden you're going to have an expanded story because this guy says, well, he knows this, and that is the case, so I may as well go ahead and tell him the rest of this. That's kind of the way that the interrogation process goes. And what's happened at Guantanamo is that, you know, it's been there for a number of years now. September 11 is unfortunately 12 years behind us now. But we are still gathering information from detainees at Guantanamo who have been there from the very first day it opened on acts of violence that have occurred, but more significantly on the makeup of al-Qaeda, on who the members are, where they're located, where their headquarters were versus where they think their headquarters might be. There's just such a valuable source of information to be gleaned from individuals one-on-one in the interrogation process that you simply can't get otherwise. Let me refer a question back to the senator from New Hampshire. You're a prosecutor. You were the Attorney General of New Hampshire, and you prosecuted any number of criminal cases over the years as Attorney General, some including very violent cases. You're familiar with the criminal process, obviously. You're familiar with individuals who have been convicted of crimes who, in some instances, were let out of jail when their time was up or whatever, and those individuals re-engaged in criminal activity. Much like what we are seeing at Guantanamo today. You and I both talked about the recidivism rate being very high. What is your opinion as a longtime prosecutor relative to these 164 individuals who remain at Guantanamo Bay today with regard to what you think is the possibility or the probability of their re-engaging in the fight because of their long-term detention at Guantanamo?
Well, I would say that we have to go from the evidence that we have before us, where we have a 29% re-engagement rate. And let's face it, the easier decisions were made first in terms of who should be released. And now we have some very hardcore individuals who are there. And if we already have a 29% re-engagement rate of them getting back in the fight against us as terrorists, then we face a grave risk of some of the most hardened individuals getting, if we transfer them or we lessen the standard for transfer, which is really what this is doing. It's taking away the issues that I talked about, the consideration of countries that we've already transferred to but people have gotten back in. It's making it easier to transfer and weaker in terms of the national security requirements that have to be met. And I'm worried that they will get back in and then harm us and our interests because we already have a history of that. I wanted to ask you, Senator Chambliss, some have said that the cost issue is the reason we should just close Guantanamo, but to your knowledge, has anyone really done the cost estimate of all the considerations that would have to be taken into account in the United States and also the security interests of the people of this country of transferring these terrorists to the United States? And finally, I would also say the risk we face of losing intelligence if they have to be Mirandized and things like that, that's a huge cost in terms of protecting our country, is it not?
Well, it certainly is, and I think you and I need to be very clear with our colleagues here as well as the American public. When it comes to cost of detaining terrorists who carried out the horrific attacks of September 11, I think the American people are well prepared to use their taxpayer dollars to house guys like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is admitted to planning the September 11 attacks. And if we house him in a prison here inside the United States, he gets Mirandized. I'm sure the first thing he's going to do is to get a lawyer, and you and I are both lawyers, and we'd be foolish not to tell our client to hush up, don't talk anymore. And that's exactly what he would do. So the cost of detaining individuals who ripped this country apart on September 11, 2001 is really not a consideration in my mind from the standpoint of whether or not we should house those folks for the rest of their lives.
Right, and if we were to lose, for example, valuable intelligence from, if we were to get Zawahiri tomorrow, or if we had captured Osama bin Laden instead of killing him and were able to interrogate him, isn't that, the value cannot be placed on that in terms of preventing future attacks and understanding how al-Qaeda is planning things to prevent future harm to Americans. Is that right?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And if you do bring them to the United States, I'll guarantee you that's the last bit of interrogation of any of those individuals that we'll ever see. And you mentioned bin Laden. I remember at a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee where the issue of bin Laden came up during a presentation by one of the current administration Secretary of Defense, I asked the question with regard to Guantanamo Bay. I said, if you captured bin Laden tomorrow, what would you do with him? And to his credit, Secretary of Defense looked me straight in the eye and said, gee, Senator, I guess we'd have to send him to Guantanamo. And he was right. There's nowhere in America that where bin Laden would have been welcomed in the county jail or some federal institution. I don't think there's any question about that. And the 164 that are there today, in my mind, fit in that same category. Some of these individuals have never said one word to an interrogator since they've been there. Some of them, and most of them, in fact, have been very open, and we still gather intelligence from them. But if we transfer them to the United States, that's the last we'll hear from them.
Thank you.
Senator, you have the floor now.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Yeah. I've been listening to the discussion. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said. Now, the amendment we're going to be voting on is parts of 3 different amendments. I was one of them and the 2 of you. And one thing that hasn't been said is the part that I put in there on striking the provision that permits the transfer of detainees to the United States for emergency medical treatment, which is just another way of getting them there. This obsession the President has.
The time has just expired.
To ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
And the other thing is that when you transfer someone here for incarceration purposes, isn't it true that these are not criminals? These are terrorists. And what terrorists do for a living is train other people to be terrorists. And to commingle them in our prison system is something that would be a great danger to this country. And that's, you agree that's one of the major reasons that we want to keep them from the United States?
I would agree with the ranking member Inhofe. I want to thank him for his leadership, absolutely, because these are not common criminals. And these are not people who have robbed a bank. These are people who have attacked our country and who seek to get other people to attack our country. And that's for a reason why we wouldn't want to mingle them with criminals or bring them to the United States so they can be told they have the right to remain silent, because we have to protect our country by knowing what they know.
Parliamentary inquiry. You say that the time on our side has expired. And, of course, I know the chairman wants to use some time here, too. And I would only ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of his remarks, if all the time has not been consumed, that I be given a few minutes.
Mr. President.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I understand the situation is as follows, that the time between now and 4 o'clock is under majority control, and then between 4 and 5 we've not resolved that issue as to who would control time. Am I correct?
That is correct, sir.
So I think there may be more time available between 4 and 5.
I'm sorry, would the chairman repeat that? I didn't understand the question you just
Under
asked.
the existing UC, the time between now and 4 is under the control of the majority because the minority has used the time. And then at 4 o'clock, we have to enter into another UC, or we can do it now, deciding what the situation will be for the hour between 4 and the time of the vote. And so
thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I support the provisions in this bill relating to the Guantanamo Detention Facility, or Gitmo, and oppose the amendment to strike those provisions and to reinstate existing restrictions on the transfer of Gitmo detainees. Gitmo is expensive, inefficient, damaging to the U.S. international standing, harmful to our allies' ability to cooperate with us, and serves as a recruiting tool for extremists. It is not needed to secure people who should be detained and should be tried. There are other places for detention and for trial in front of a military tribunal. We don't need Gitmo to stay open at huge expense in order to do that. The bill before us makes long overdue fixes to our ability to transfer detainees out of Gitmo, to provide our military with needed flexibility to determine how long we need to detain individuals now held at the Guantanamo facility and where we should hold them. For a number of years now, Congress has enacted legislation eliminating that flexibility and requiring that we continue to hold all Gitmo detainees at Guantanamo, whether or not it is in our national security interest to do so. The current law establishes an absolute ban on bringing any Gitmo detainee to the United States for any purpose, including detention, trial, incarceration, or even medical treatment. And it replaces the best judgment of our military and intelligence experts on the risk posed by an additional Gitmo detainee with a cumbersome checklist of requirements that must be certified before any detainee may be transferred overseas. The current law makes it more difficult to try detainees for their crimes and nearly impossible to return them to their home countries. For example, even if we have a strong case that a detainee has committed crimes for which he could be indicted and convicted in federal court, the current law makes it impossible to try him there. This is true even in cases where similar charges are not available before a military commission, making it impossible to try the detainee at Guantanamo. And it is true even in cases where the security risk in bringing the detainee to the United States would be non-existent. In 2010, the Guantanamo Detainee Review Task Force recommended 44 Gitmo detainees for possible prosecution. As a result, in significant part of the legislative restrictions on transferring detainees to the United States for trial, however, we have had only 4 of the 44 plea bargains and no other successful prosecutions of those detainees. Similarly, even if we have determined that a detainee poses no ongoing security threat to the United States, we cannot send him back to his home country unless the Secretary of Defense certifies to 6 conditions addressing issues such as countries' control over their own territory and its detention facilities and so forth. And even if the individual is likely to die without advanced medical treatment, we cannot remove him from Gitmo for the purpose of receiving such treatment. In 2010, the Guantanamo Detainee Review Task Force conducted a rigorous interagency review and determined that more than half of the Gitmo population, including 84 of the 164 detainees currently at Gitmo, could be safely transferred overseas without posing a significant security threat. However, only 2 Gitmo detainees have actually been transferred using the certification provision since it was enacted at the end of 2010. Under the current law, even if a detainee has been convicted or pled guilty and served his sentence, even if he has cooperated with us and provided us with useful intelligence, even if he has renounced all ties to al-Qaeda or the Taliban, even if he has been determined to no longer pose a threat to our national security, it is still extremely difficult to transfer or release a Gitmo detainee. That is why we still have detainees sitting at Guantanamo who have been cleared for transfer or release on multiple occasions by 2 different administrations over a period of almost a decade. The current law has reinforced, as a result, the impression held by many around the world that Guantanamo is a legal black hole, where we hold detainees without recourse This perception has been used by our enemies to recruit jihadists to attack us. It has made our friends less willing to cooperate with us in our efforts to fight terrorism around the world. And for this reason, many of our top national security leaders spanning the Bush and Obama administrations have repeatedly told us of the harm that Gitmo causes to our national security. The provisions of this bill would change current law and provide needed flexibility to our military in two key ways. First, with respect to transfers of Gitmo detainees overseas to their home countries or other countries, the bill would streamline the onerous certification procedures imposed by Congress and restore the ability of our military leaders to exercise their best judgment in determining whether detainees could be transferred abroad consistent with our national security. This provision would enable the Department of Defense to handle Gitmo detainees in the same way that it has handled other detainees in the course of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, by making case-by-case determinations whether it is in our national security interest to continue holding an individual. Second, with respect to transfers of Gitmo detainees into the United States, the bill would reverse the one-size-fits-all ban that Congress has imposed on such transfers and permit case-by-case determinations of whether it is in our national security interest to transfer Gitmo detainees into custody inside the United States for detention and trial. This provision would restore our nation's ability to use a key tool in the fight against the terrorist threat, and that tool is prosecution of Gitmo detainees in federal courts. I have offered a side-by-side amendment with Senator McCain, which requires the administration to develop a comprehensive plan and submit it to Congress before it could transfer any detainees to the United States under this provision. This plan would include a case-by-case determination where each individual held at Guantanamo, where the individual is intended to be held, including the specific facility or facilities inside the United States that would be used and the estimated costs of any modification needed at those facilities. The side-by-side amendment would also clarify that Gitmo detainees would not gain any additional legal rights as a result of their transfer to the United States for detention and trial. In particular, detainees who are transferred to the United States would not gain any additional rights, would not be permitted to be released inside the United States, would not lose their status as unprivileged enemy belligerents eligible for detention and trial under the law of war, would not gain any right, any additional right to challenge his or her detention beyond the right to habeas corpus, which they already have at Guantanamo, as the Supreme Court has decided. I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that Senator Feinstein be added as a co-sponsor to our side-by-side amendment, the Levin McCain amendment.
Without objection.
Guantanamo continues to be a damaging reminder of a failed strategy that sought to put captured terrorists beyond the reach of the law in U.S. courts. A dozen years ago, the Bush administration started sending detainees to Gitmo in large part out of a desire to avoid the jurisdiction of the United States courts and ensure that detainees would have no legal avenue to appeal their convictions. Now, whether or not one adopted, whether or not one supported that approach, that argument ended in 2008 when the Supreme Court, in the Boumediene case, ruled that Gitmo detainees would be treated as being inside the United States for the purpose of habeas corpus appeals. Instead of recognizing that the problems with maintaining the Gitmo facility, the problems of extreme cost, and that it adds no additional security to what exists if these people are brought to the United States for military trial, as being held as prisoners under the laws of war, or for federal court trial. Even though all of that is still possible inside the United States, we've enacted legislation which makes it virtually impossible to move detainees anywhere else. ensuring that the facility is going to remain open whether we need it or not. Now, the result is that we're stuck with an expensive facility. And make no mistake, the costs of the Guantanamo detention facility are exorbitant. The Department of Defense has put the cost associated with Gitmo at over $400 million a year. That's more than $2.5 million per detainee. If we had any additional security as a result, it would be worth it. But we don't need Gitmo for additional security. These detainees can be held in the United States. They can be held for trial. They can be held according to the rule of law. They can be held under the military as military detainees. Now, $2.5 million per detainee. By some estimates, that is 35 times the annual cost of housing a prisoner at a supermax security prison inside the United States. And that does not include the more than $200 million in additional military construction requests that the Department believes it needs to spend to keep Guantanamo running in the coming years. And you know, Mr. President, again, I want to repeat this. If this added to our security, it'd be worth it. But it doesn't. If we can bring these same people to the United States to be held as prisoners of war, the way we did Italians and others during World War II. I had hundreds of them in my own home state. If we added to our security by keeping Guantanamo open, instead of just having a place which is used as a training ground and used as an argument for jihad, we can keep these people in the United States safely, just as safely as Guantanamo, in maximum security prisons or under the military jurisdiction, with the same amount of security for the people of the United States at far less costs. Now, we are all facing sequestration. It's undermining the readiness of our armed forces and requires risky reductions in force structure, makes it likely we're going to have to cancel or severely curtail vital modernization programs. We cannot afford to spend $500 million a year on a program that doesn't make us more safe. The basis for the legislative obstacles to moving detainees out of Guantanamo appears to be the fear that returning Gitmo detainees to their home countries or transferring them to the United States would pose an unacceptable threat to our national security. But history has shown that we bring numerous terrorists to the United States for trial, for incarceration. It's had no adverse effect on our national security. These prosecutions have resulted in hundreds of convictions on terrorism-related charges without apparent adverse effect to our national security. The Attorney General wrote the Judiciary Committee, wrote Chairman Leahy last week, that terrorist prosecutions in federal courts have been, quote, an essential element of our counterterrorism efforts, close quote, and a powerful tool of proven effectiveness. And in the last 3 years, Mr. President, we brought 3 foreign terrorists to the United States for trial. We brought Abu Ghaith, Osama bin Laden's son-in-law. He's been convicted in a federal court, remains in federal custody without incident. The second is Ahmed Warsaim, who pled guilty in federal court, remains in federal custody without incident. The third is Ahmed Galani, who was convicted in federal court, received a life sentence, remains in federal custody without incident. And again, there's been hundreds of convictions in this country of persons connected to terrorism in federal courts. And our military, Mr. President, has routinely detained individuals on the battlefield in Afghanistan and then exercised their discretion to transfer them to local jurisdiction or to release them. If we can trust our military to make these determinations on a day-to-day basis for detainees in Afghanistan, we should be able to trust our military to make the same determination for detainees at Gitmo. The rigorous review process, which is codified by our bill's provisions, requires the Secretary of Defense to determine, prior to transferring a Gitmo detainee that the transfer is in our national security interest and that actions have been taken to mitigate any risk that the detainee could again engage in any activity that threatens United States persons or interests. The provision in this bill will get us past our fear that we cannot securely handle Gitmo detainees in this country. It would allow the Secretary of Defense to authorize Gitmo transfers to the United States for detention and trial if doing so is in the United States security interest. This bill will restore the President's ability to choose the most effective tool, whether that's military commissions or federal courts, to bring these Gitmo detainees to justice. And so I would urge in conclusion, Mr. President, that our colleagues support the Guantanamo provisions in the bill, vote for the Levin, McCain, Feinstein side-by-side amendment, and oppose the effort to reinstate the counterproductive and costly restrictions in current law. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, it's my understanding that at 4 o'clock there might be a unanimous consent request that will lead us to a vote at 5 o'clock. Is that correct?
The chair really has no knowledge about the vote at 5.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
I would yield the time between now and 4 o'clock to the senator from Oklahoma.
All right.
The objection.
All right, Mr. President, it seems like we're going to have an opportunity a little later on to discuss this. We'll have more time tonight. And while in the capacity of the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, I have to say that I can't imagine having a chairman that with whom I cooperate on and agree with on almost every issue, like the Chairman Levin, and I really appreciate the work that we've done together. We both recognize that this is the most important piece of legislation each year. We both recognize that for 51 consecutive years we've had this legislation. Nothing's come up to obstruct it. We also realize that the Republicans would prefer to have more opportunities to have amendments. And I know that Chairman Levin has been very helpful in helping us to get that. I would say this, though, the area where I don't agree is in the area of Gitmo and how it should be used. Every time I go to Gitmo, I look at it, I shake my head, and I think, why in the world would we not use this resource? We don't have another resource like it. You heard the senator from Georgia make the statement that he asked the chairman, you know, if we don't have Gitmo to send these people, where are we going to send it? And I think it was Secretary of Defense Panetta said, well, we don't know. There is not another place. We've used this successfully since 1904. And I often have said, and I said yesterday, that we don't have many good deals in government. This is one that is. Since 1904, our rent on that territory down there has been $4,000 a year. Now, can the chair come up with any better deal than we've had down there? No, I don't think anyone can. And besides that, Castro doesn't collect it about half the time. So anyway, this is good. Now, when you argue that you can use it for interrogation, if you stop and think about Osama bin Laden, the information that we got that ended up to his demise was actually gotten from interrogation that took place no place else than Gitmo. I would also say that when you talk about the treatment of people there, the one thing that I discover every time I go down there is that one of the chief problems that they have in Gitmo is obesity, because they're eating better than they've ever eaten any other time in their life. The primary care provider is there for every 45 detainees. They've never had that kind of treatment the rest in any other time of their lives. The detainees receive age-appropriate colon cancer screening, TB screening, annual dental procedures, physical therapy, and all these things. And the idea that we would not be able to bring them to the United States for some more serious personal care, I can't buy that, because we have the U.S. Naval Hospital at Guantanamo Bay. I've been there. They have 250 approximately personnel there that support the base's population of over 6,000. And so I would just say that when I look at this and I think of the options that they have, and this obsession the President seems to have to bring these terrorists into the United States. I have to share this one story because I know that there's going to be a request here in just a moment. But I can remember back 4.5 years ago when this President first went in office, he had, and I'm going from memory now, I think 17 places in the United States where you could put these terrorists. One happened to be in my state of Oklahoma, down at Fort Sill. And I went down to look at the facility. And the major who was in charge of it, she told me that she had had several tours of duty in Guantanamo, and she said, go back and tell those people in Washington that we don't need to be spreading these terrorists out through the continental United States when we have that great facility. She said she had been there twice, and it's the state-of-the-art. It's one that I have a great fear, and that is that once we get a different administration here who realizes the value of Guantanamo Bay, it would be too late to go back and get it again. That's the reason that we've been holding on to it with white knuckles. Well, the amendment that you're going to be voting on in just another hour or so, whenever it's set in, is going to be an amendment that will allow us to continue to use what I consider one of the most valuable assets that we have in our detention system. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Michigan.
Mr. President, I'm going to make the unanimous consent proposal, which I understand has been cleared. I ask unanimous consent that the pending motion to recommit be withdrawn, that the pending Levin Amendment 2123 be set aside for Senator Ayotte or designee to offer amendment number 2255 relative to Guantanamo, that the amendment be subject to a relevant side-by-side amendment, which is number 2175 from Senators Levin, McCain, and Feinstein, that no second-degree amendments be in order to either of these Guantanamo amendments, that each of these amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, that the time until 5 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or their designees, and that at 5 p.m. the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Ayotte Amendment number 2255, that upon disposition of the Ayotte Amendment, the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Levin-McCain-Feinstein Amendment number 2175, and there be 2 minutes equally divided in between the votes.
Is there objection?
Now?
Without objection.
Mr. President, go ahead and conclude.
Well, no, I was going to say now the time between now and 5 o'clock is equally divided, as I understand, between Senator from Oklahoma and myself, and I yield the floor.
That's great.
And on behalf of Senators Ayotte, Chambliss, myself, and others, I call up amendment number 2255 and ask the clerk to report by number.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Inhofe, proposes an amendment number 2255 for Ms. Ayotte and others.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I call up amendment number 2175.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Michigan, Mr. Levin, proposes amendment number 2175.
I understand that we have a senator on his way here, and I would note the absence of quorum unless someone else wishes to be recognized, and ask that the time on the quorum call be equally divided unless someone else seeks to be recognized at this time.
Without objection.
Note
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the forum call in process be vitiated.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, during this pause, and if somebody comes down to talk about the two amendments that will be voted on at 5 o'clock, I would be happy to defer to them. But I think it's important we understand we're finally making some headway in getting into this defense authorization bill. It seems like every year for 51 years now we've been able to get it through while other bills become controversial, get to a point where they can't go any further. That doesn't happen with the defense authorization bill. It's one that has to be, it has to take place. And let me thank, as the Republican ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, let me just say that, as I've said before, that thank my friend and my colleague, the chairman, Carl Levin, for his leadership in marking up this bill. It's always been difficult. In most cases, we agree with each other. We happen to be looking at an amendment now where we disagree. But I've always considered the NDAA bill as the most important piece of legislation in Congress every year. And it contains authorizations that support our men and women serving in harm's way, all the way in Afghanistan and around the world. It supports the training of our service members and the maintenance and modernization of their equipment. It authorizes research and development. That's R&D efforts that will ensure we maintain technological superiority over our enemies and can defeat the threats of tomorrow. But most importantly, it provides for the pay and the benefits of the brave men and women who have made their sacrifices and are putting their lives at risk for our benefit. However, it is important to note this year, and this has not happened before in my memory, that the bill provides all of these vitally important efforts only as the reduced spending levels would allow. In an era increasing defined by partisan gridlock, the NDAA is one of the rare occasions when both members of both parties can come together. This enduring commitment was exemplified again this year by the overwhelming bipartisan support when we had the bill that came out of our committee, bipartisan support. And we want to, of course, to have that same bipartisan support on the floor here. And hopefully we'll be able to get this done by the end of this week. Now, consideration of this year's NDAA comes at a time in our national security when we face more volatile and dangerous times than we ever have in the history of this country. The chaos and the violence are on the rise in the Middle East and North Africa. Al-Qaeda is growing and establishing new safe havens from which to plan and launch attacks against the United States. We have rogue nations like Iran and North Korea. It's not like it was in the old days, that I've often said the good old days of the Cold War, when we had an enemy, and that enemy was predictable. We knew that enemy. Remember, we used to have this thing called mutual assured destruction. Well, that meant something in those days. It doesn't mean anything now, because our potential enemies out there want to be destroyed. It's a different mentality that they have now than they used to. And Iran and North Korea, with their developing of their nuclear capabilities and their delivery systems. Our intelligence has told us that Iran will have a weapon and a delivery system that all the way back to 2007 said that they would have it by 2015. That's a year and a half from right now, I tell the chair, that they're going to have that capability. And the threats are much more serious to us. Now, when I say that this is the first time we've faced the crisis we're facing now, it's not just because the enemy is out there. I mean, I'm talking about an enemy that will have the capability of sending a weapon over and delivering it to the United States. But at the same time, over the last 5 years, this administration, the military, has already endured a $487 billion cut. That's $487 billion out of the defense budget. And that is before sequestration. Now we have sequestration. An outcome once thought to be so egregious, I can remember just as recently as less than a year ago, we thought that we're not going to have this. We can't, after $487 billion being pulled out of the military, we can't also have sequestration, which would be another $500 billion that would come out. in the next period of time. And that's, so we didn't think it happened, but it did happen. And we're now into, what, our 7th or 8th month of sequestration. In total, our military men and women stand to endure over $1 trillion slash from their budget. And these cuts are forcing a dramatic decline in military readiness and capabilities. General Odierno, talked to General Odierno yesterday. He's Chief of Staff of the Army. He recently said that his forces are at the, and I'm going to quote now, Mr. President, quote, the, quote, lowest readiness levels I've seen within our Army since I've been serving for the last 37 years, and that the only 2 brigades are ready for combat. That's our United States Army. We've never had that confession made, but it's a level of desperation where they're willing to come out and talk about we cannot sustain another $500 billion of cuts. Admiral Greener, he's chief of CNO, Chief of Naval Operations. He said, and I'm quoting him now, he said, because of fiscal limitations and the situation we're in, we don't have another strike group trained and ready to respond on short notice in case of emergencies. We're tapped out. That's the CNO of the Navy. Our top military leaders now warn of being unable to protect Americans' interests around the world. Admiral Winfield, keep in mind Admiral Winfield is the number 2 person in line. He's the vice chairman, vice chief of staff. Of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He stated earlier this year, and this is a quote, he said, there could be, now this is Admiral Winfield, who's been there for I think nearly 40 years. He said, there could be, for the first time in my career, instances where we may be asked to respond to a crisis, and we will have to say, we cannot. General Dempsey, the number 1 guy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's warned that continued national security cuts will, and I'm quoting again, severely limit our ability to implement our defense strategy. It will put the nation at greater risk of coercion. It will break faith with men and women in uniform. And this is why I'm so troubled by the disastrous path that we're on. In face of the mounting threats to America, we're crippling the very people who are vital to our security, the men and women in uniform. To be clear, our military was facing readiness shortfalls even before sequestration took effect. Nearly 12 years ago, or 12 years of sustained combat operations have really worn our equipment and our forces down. In order to meet the spending caps mandated by sequestration, the military services are being forced to starve the accounts necessary to repair and reset their forces. And rather than rebuilding and the ability of our military to defend the country, we're digging ourselves deeper in a hole. The longer we allow military readiness and capabilities to decline, the more money and time it will take to rebuild. We already know this is the case based on what happened in 2013. General Welsh, he's Chief of Staff of the Air Force. General Welsh said that because of the first round of sequestration cuts, he said, and I'm quoting, he said, we were forced to ground 33 squadrons. He's talking about fighter squadrons, including 13 combat-coded squadrons, as in addition to 7 squadrons were reduced to basic takeoff and landing training. It will now cost a minimum of 10% more flying hours to fully retrain the grounded squadrons. Now, what he's saying is that when it was mandated that he take down 33 squadrons, that happened about April. Then in July, 3 months later, they said, all right, you can start working your squadrons again. But what he's saying here is it costs more to retrain and to bring these people back up in their proficiencies than it was saved during that 3-month period of time. And he said specifically it will now cost a minimum of 10% more flying hours to fully retain the grounded squadrons that it would have simply to keep them training all along. So we've gotten that from several of the other top people. General Amos, I talked to him yesterday. He's the Marine Corps. He said he has approximately $800 million in critical military construction funding that will be unable to execute under sequestration. That's assuming they go through the sequestration. By the way, Mr. President, I have not given up on stopping the military sequestration. that's damaging our ability to defend ourselves. But he said, General Amos said, that the military construction funding will be unable to execute under sequestration and will need to be deferred. Further, it will cost over $6.5 billion to buy back orders of the V-22s, the Joint Strike Fighters, the Hueys, and the Cobras. Those are 4 systems, 4 platforms that we would have to go in and bring back at the cost, additional cost of $6.5 billion that we otherwise wouldn't have to spend if we had continued these on track. Admiral Greener on Monday told me that under the current budget environment, he'll be forced to defer much-needed ship maintenance, causing a 15% to 20% increase in total cost. In other words, the things that they're doing now to meet these line-by-line mandates of reductions are not saving money but costing money. Under sequestration, we'll lose 1 Virginia-class submarine, 1 littoral combat ship, 1 afloat forward staging base, development of an Ohio-class replacement submarine program. They'll be all delayed, again, leading to an increased price. So not only is sequestration gutting our military capabilities, it ends up costing American taxpayers more than it will save. We're falling victim to the misguided belief that as the wars of today wind down, we can afford to gut investments in our nation's defenses. It's irresponsible and makes America less safe. I remember going through the same thing back in the 90s when the chant at that time was, well, the Cold War is over. We no longer need that strong of a defense. And we heard it from both sides, and now we're going through the same thing. History reminds us we can't dictate when and where the next conflict is going to arise. Instead, if we allow the continued dismantling of our military, we will be less safe, less prepared to defend the country. And if our military men and women are called upon, their ability to accomplish the mission will be undermined, and tragically more will lose their lives unnecessary. You know, we had the top military people in our Armed Services Committee, and I asked them at my request, they talked about how the loss of readiness, the risk equals lives. You take on more risk, you lose more American lives. General Amos, Commandant of the Marine Corps, testified that if he's tasked to respond to a contingency in the current budget environment, he said, and I'm quoting now, we will have fewer forces arriving less trained, arriving later to the fight. This would delay the buildup of combat power, allow the enemy more time to build its defenses, and would likely prolong combat operations altogether. This is a formula for more American casualties. Again, that's General Amos, the Commandant of the Air Force. Such an outcome would be immoral and a dereliction of duty if we expect the men and women in our military to go into harm's way to protect America. We have an obligation to provide them with the training, the technology, the capabilities required to decisively overwhelm any adversary at any time and return safely to home and to the loved ones. I can remember when they used to use a different term than they use today. Today they call it major military operations. It used to be defending America on how many fronts. It was always 2 fronts ever since World War II. Now we're down where we would have a hard time doing it on 1 front. That's the problem that we're facing right now. That's why this bill is so important. And this is why ending sequestration and protecting the readiness of our military men and women remains my top priority. However, something's got to be done now to mitigate the devastating impacts to readiness that we find long-term solutions. Every day that goes by without action only increases the damage. And this is why I do have an amendment that would phase sequester in a way that would allow our senior military leaders to enact reforms without disproportionately degrading our military to train and prepare our military women and men. What it is, and I know that we're joining forces between my good friend, the senator from Alabama, and myself, to have an amendment that's going to allow to have some degree of latitude, some flexibility, so that while you're living under the same budget constraints that we are under today, they can make some decisions where it's not just an online reduction And I've just finished talking about how much more that it will end up costing us. So I see now we have someone else who's come to the floor to be heard, and I just want to re-stress, and as I started this off, I want to repeat that how much I appreciate the chairman of the committee, Carl Levin, and his cooperation with our side in trying to get this and become a reality and get this bill passed, particularly, hopefully, this week. I yield the floor.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, before I yield time to the senator from California, I would ask unanimous consent that Alec Johnson, a legislative fellow detailed to the Committee on Appropriations,